Yes, yes. I just wanted to welcome everybody to the traditional, Erev, the Chag, Erev, the holiday shir that Rabbi Rosensweig delivers to our community. And I just wanted to thank Rabbi Rosensweig for spending time with us, delivering this very high level shiur before each and every Chag elevates the Chag, but especially for Purim. Purim is a time where we're taught, according to Chazal, that we need to strengthen our limud Torah, our commitment to the Torah and Torah Sheba'al Peh, and Rabbi Rosensweig's shiurim definitely addresses that need. So please, thank you so much for your time, and I wish everybody a Purim Sameach, and please God, Yeshuos for Klal Yisrael.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Excuse me, Rabbi. Excuse me for interrupting. Will we be dealing with the answer to the question from last week next week?
I guess so. I hope so.
Okay.
Which question? I think we left with a few.
The question was of a woman who actually has an embryo in the freezer.
Oh! I don't know if we'll do that. I think I gave you some of the, some of the precedents for that. I don't know if we'll deal with that next week because we're in the middle of some other thing. But I absolutely will, get to it a little bit down the road when we have a little more context. Yeah, but that was a very fascinating question, and I think I mentioned the Noda B'Yehuda precedent of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Before we begin, I see that Rabbi Roth is on the Zoom, and I got some advanced intelligence that Rabbi Roth recently celebrated an important milestone, a birthday, and spoke in the synagogue. I try to keep up, so I just wanted to wish him, Mazel Tov and many good, happy, healthy years, of nachas from his family, and that the community should have the bracha also of continuing to learn from him and to hear from him. He's a staple, not just staple, but a critical linchpin in our shiurim, and has been from the beginning. And it's really always a big schus to have him, participate. His insights are appreciated and his presence is appreciated. So, Shigo Mechoyel Ochoyel, for many, many years in good health and continued vibrancy. Okay. I want to talk about, my pleasure. I want to talk about Purim. So I want to talk about a phenomenon in Purim that we've discussed on the years, but I want to talk about the perspective of the Ramban in particular on this issue. But to do so, let's begin with the beginning. So the first Mishnah in Masechet Megillah identifies multiple times for Kriyas HaMegillah. Right? The Mishnah says, this is, I'm assuming everybody has the Mar Makomos, so this is on page 1, that Megillah nikres be'achad asar, b'shneim asar, b'shlosha asar, ba'abar asar, b'chamisha asar, that Kriyas HaMegillah can actually take place, from day number 11 of Adar, all the way till day 15. And then the Mishnah elaborates more fully, that walled cities that have been walled since the time of Yehoshua ben Nun, they read Korin Becha Misha Asar on the 15th day of Adar, and Kfarim Vayaros Gedolos, if you have villages and large open cities, Korin Ba'arba Asar, they read on the 14th. Ela Shakfarim Maknimim Liyom Aknisa. But the villages, which are very small, for various reasons, they decided to have them read on either a Monday or a Thursday. And as such, depending on when Yud Daled, the 14th of Adar, fell out, you would end up reading in the Kfarim, in the little towns, either on a Monday or Thursday. It would end up being somewhere, it could be 11, it could be 12, it could be the 13th, in addition to the 14th. And that's what the Mishnah describes. Ketzad Chalios Arba Asar Basheni. If the 14th day of Adar, which is the day of reading in big cities, if it falls out on a Monday, sorry, so then there's no problem. Then Kvarim Vayaros Gedolos Karim Bo Bayom. Then on the same day, on that Monday, since it's a Monday and a Thursday anyway, and it's the 14th, you have the best of all worlds, and therefore you'll have Kriyas HaMegillah. Mukefes Koma will be Lamachar. The walled cities, which typically read on the 15th, so that would be on a Tuesday, and that's fine as well. On the other hand, Cholios Bishlishi Obervi, if the Yudalit, the 14th, comes out on either a Tuesday or a Wednesday, so then Kfarim Makdimin Liyom HaKnisa, so then the Kfar, those small villages, would end up reading the Megillah earlier on the Monday, which would either be the 13th, right, or the 12th. Right, it would be the 13th to the 12th. Bayaris Gedolos Karim Bayom. The big cities would read on the 14th as usual. Umakefes Choma Lamachar, and the walled cities would read as always on the 15th. But Chol Lios Bechamishi, let's say Purim came out on a Thursday, Yudalid came out on a Thursday. Again, Karim Bayaris Gedolos Karim Bo Bayom. So then the villages, you don't have to make any kind of special Kadima, you didn't have to make their Kriya earlier because Monday and Thursday are fine. So they would all do on the 14th, which is on a Thursday. Kfar Mayaris Gedolos Karim Bo Bayom. Mukefes Choma would be Lamachar on the Friday. And Cholios Erev Shabbos, if the 14th fell out on a Friday, so Kvarim Makdimim Liyom HaKnisa, the Kvar would go back to the Thursday. Bayaros Gedolos Mukafes Choma, and at that time the large cities and the walled cities would both read Korin Bo Bayom on Friday, because you can't have Kriyas HaMegillah on a Shabbos, and therefore if the 15th was on a Shabbos, then there would be a Kadima, on the 14th, the ear and the Krach would both read on the 14th. Cholios b'Shabbos, if the 14th came out on a Shabbos, right? So Kfarim Vayaris Gedolos Makdimim V'Karim Liyom HaKnisa, they would push back the reading in the big cities and the villages not to Friday but to Thursday. That would be the 12th, in other words. Mukefes Choma L'Machar, but the walled cities could read it as they always do on the 15th, because that would be on a Sunday. That's not a problem. Cholios Achar Shabbos, if it turned out to be on a Sunday, so Kvar Makdim and Liyom HaKnisa, they would push the Kvar back to the Thursday before the Sunday. Vayaris Gedolos Karim Bo Bayom Mukefes Choma L'Machar. The walled cities would read on the Monday, because that would be the 15th, and the big cities would read on a Sunday. So this is the Mishnah that tells us that the timing when it comes to Kriyas HaMegillah is a little bit complicated, that there's a range of days in which Kriyas HaMegillah could take place, depending on A, when the calendar, when Yud Daled falls out on which day of the week, B, whether we're talking about Kfarim, villages, Ayaros, Golos, big cities, or Krach, Mukefes Choma, walled cities. So that is the thrust of the Mishnah. The Gemara immediately, if you look in the Marmakomos, wonders about this. The Gemara says, Heicha Remiza. Like, how do you know that you can have Kriyas HaMegillah on such a range of days? We'll get to this in a moment. So the Gemara says, Amrav Shemon Bar Abba, Amrav Yochanan, Omar Kolik Kayem Es Yimei HaPurim Ha'elu Bizmanehem. The Megillah speaks about, it says L'Kayem, to fulfill Yimei HaPurim, these days of Purim, Bizmanehem, in their times. That's a plural usage. So the limud is, the drasha is that Zmanim Harbe Tiknu Lahem. They instituted on multiple, times in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyas HaMegillah. It isn't simply focused on a single day. Okay, so it's this phenomenon that caught the eye of already the Rishonim, and the question seems obvious. If you look at the Mar Makomos, and you go to page number 5,
In
Rabban
general, is very askance about having more than one central timing for any event in Jewish life.
right.
Because
So that's what the Ramban's going to address.
it breaks up the, it's like you have two separate Mesorahs. It's contrary to everything.
Right, exactly. So this is what I want to talk. I want to talk about the Ramban's approach to this in particular, and to illustrate it a little more in terms of some of the halachos. So this is the question that the Ramban, if you look at the Ramban, it says here, number Yud Aleph, Chidush Ramban Masachet Megillah Dav Beis Amud Aleph. So the Ramban is the one who articulated this the most, the most acutely, we'll say. And if you could follow his language, first we'll talk about the question, then we'll see, what some of the approaches are. So the Ramban says, Masha Shaninu, this, information that we are accessing in the Mishnah, that Bismanehem means Zmanim Harbe Tiknu Lehem Chachamim, that Kriyas HaMegillah can take place from a range of days from the 11th of Adar all the way to the 15th, right? Krachin Amukafin Choma Mimos Yoshua Binun Korim B'chamisha Asar. Kfarim Vayaris Gedolos Ba'arba Asar. So what bothered the Ramban most was not the Kfarim, the villages. So let me make clear. The villages is an accommodation. For whatever reason, there are various explanations of why, but these are very small locales, and there wasn't, a critical mass of people, that serviced, the shuls in these places, and there are other considerations too. So the kfar, it was deemed appropriate that if you lived in a small village near a big city, that Monday and Thursday, would be the appropriate time to do Kriyas HaMegillah. But it isn't really comparable to the division, that is reflected by the 14th and the 15th. 14th and the 15th, it's broken up by open cities and walled cities. And it's not a practical accommodation. It's the initial takana, the initial structuring of Purim was made to reflect two different days. So what bothers the Ramban is the second issue. The first issue is more of a technical, everybody agrees that the Kfar is obligated and their real Purim is on the 14th. The only thing is that the Kriyas HaMegillah was made earlier. The Gemara does say that when Kriyas HaMegillah in the Kfar is earlier, we'll get to this a little bit later, when do you have the Su'uda, and when do you have Mishloach Manos, and when do you have Matanos Le'evyonim? So the Gemara says that when it comes to Matanos Le'evyonim, Eineim Shalaniyim Nesuos L'Kriyas HaMegillah, that the poor, they know, those who are collecting tzedakah, they know that there's a Kriyas HaMegillah going on, in the kfar, and they expect, literally, it's very interesting language, Eineim Shalaniyim, the eyes of the aniyim, Nesuos, are raised L'Kriyas HaMegillah, meaning they have an expectation that if people are reading Megillah, that there will be people there and that they'll be in a festive and philanthropic mood. And of course, Matanos Le'evyonim, is one of the important expressions of Purim. So the Evyonim anticipated that they would be taken care of already at Kriyas HaMegillah. But aside from that, when it comes to Mishloach Manos and when it comes to the Su'uda, the Mishta, the Simcha of Purim, the Gemara says that, we'll get back to this a little later on, but the Gemara says in Daf Hey that the Mishta, the Simcha of Purim only takes place bismana, in the right time. It doesn't
It
take place
doesn't
when there's an
bother,
accommodation earlier. What's that?
it doesn't bother the Ramban that when Purim comes out on Sunday, that the villages will be having Purim while the rest of them will be fasting on Tainus Esther.
If Purim comes out on Sunday,
So the Tainus comes out like this year on Thursday. And meanwhile, in the villages, they'll be having Purim on Thursday.
yeah, okay. That's an interesting question. If you want my short answer, that's a very interesting point. If you want my short answer to that question, and maybe we could talk about that next year, Tanis Esther is a different kind of a fast.
Yeah, but still, notwithstanding
Tanis Esther is actually
contradiction
not. 1 second. Tanis Esther is not even though it is discussed by the Rambam in Hilchos Tainus along with the other fasts, but it's not one of the Zechariah fasts, and it is it's actually the when the Gemara calls the 13th day of Adar, the Gemara says it's Yom Kihila Lakolhi. So Rabbeinu Tam interprets that to mean that was the day when Esther said Lech Knos HaYehudim, and all of Klal Yisrael, davened and fasted, given the plight that was taking place. So when you think about it, Rabbeinu Tam is kind of addressing your question, but not as a problem, but as a solution. The Gemara says, what is so significant about day number 13 of Adar that it would qualify occasionally to be a time of Kriyas HaMegillah? So the answer is because Zman Kihila Lakolhi. But according to Rabbeinu Tam, what that means is that was the day of Tanis Esther, right? That's exactly your point. But the answer is that Tanis Esther, as I said, is not, most fast days are what we call Midarkei HaTshuva. They're sad days in the calendar. They're days that commemorate terrible things that happen. Shivasa B'Tammuz, Asar B'Teves, of course, Tzom Gedalia, of course, Tisha B'Av. So these are days days of gloom, days of doom. The Gemara says about these other Tanios that if there's ever a question when to commemorate them, the rule is the Gemara in Megillah, that Agdume Puranusa lo mekadmina. What that means is, we don't anticipate bad news or sad occasions. We'd rather push it off. If Tisha B'Av, falls out on a Shabbos, we don't observe Tisha B'Av on Friday or on Thursday. We observe it as a nidcha on the Sunday. Akdume Puranusa lo mekadmina. But that's not true about Tainus Esther. When are we going to observe Tainus Esther this year?
Thursday.
On Thursday, right? Even though, really.
Well, Ralph, you got to lower it a little bit.
Purim is on
Please.
Sunday, so it should have been on Shabbos, but we're
Please
going
lower
to
it
be
a little.
Tainus Esther. What happened to the principle of Akdume Puranusa lo mekadminan? So the answer is the same answer that I guess gave you for Rabbeinu Tam, but that's a whole different topic. I don't want to get too deeply involved in, and that is that the fast of Tainus Esther is different. It's a triumphant fast. It's a fast that proves the Ribono Shel Olam's hashgacha, and as such, it is part of the kiyum. It's part of the joy of Purim, even though it's not joyous to fast, but it's a fast, that takes on a very different, character. I'll give you one other example. The it's again, that's why Rabbeinu Tam says that Tainus Esther, Zman Kihila Lakol, is actually a reason for Kriyas HaMegillah, which is what you were asking me. How is it possible that there'll be a Kriyas HaMegillah while other people are fasting? The answer is Efshar v'Efshar, that's Zman Kihila Lakol. But I want to give you one other proof from the Ravid, famous Ravid. The Ravid in his Sagos in Masechet Tainus discusses the following question. This is a question that many Rishonim ask, and that is, we have a rule called, we have a list called Megillas Tainus. Megillas Tainus is a list of the days in which miracles took place, days of special joy, in which it's Asr behesped b'tainis. Just like we say, we'll get to in a few minutes, like even Adar Rishon, by the way, right? This year we had Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni, right? We had a leap year. So even in Adar Rishon, you don't say Tachanun, and it's prohibited to have a hesped, a eulogy, or fast day, a tainus, on even Adar Rishon's, Yud Daled and Tesvav. It's very interesting. Because in some respect, these are days de lo l'misped bahon, de lo l'yisana bahon. They're not days of fasting and of eulogy. They are days of Megillas Tainus. So one of the rules of Megillas Tainus is a whole list of these names. So most of them were canceled. After the Churban Beis Hamikdash, they canceled the days of Megillas Tainus. The exception, of course, is Hanukkah and Purim. I believe in the shir before Hanukkah, we talked about this aspect of Hanukkah. But anyways, one of the rules of Megillas Tainus is that you're not allowed to fast not only on the day of Megillas Tainus, when the miracle or the joyous occasion occurred, you're not allowed to fast on the day before or the day after either. So of course, all the Rishonim ask, how would you explain Tainus Esther? Right? After all, Tainus Esther, Esther's fast took place on Yud Gimel before Yud Daled. And again, this year it's a little bit different because of the calendar. But in a typical year, when Yud Daled, when the 14th is not on a Sunday, it's somewhere in the middle of the week. So we have Tainus Esther the day before. So how come? I mean, it's Megillas Tainus. That's the that's the most elemental rule of Megillas Tainus. And if anything, Purim is more prominent than Megillas Tainus typically because Purim and Hanukkah apply even in our time where there is no Megillas Tainus. So how could it be more enduring, more impactful, which it is, and not have the rule that you can't fast in advance? So the Ravid, actually says this idea. The Ravid says, Tainus Esther is not a typical fast. A typical fast is something that you do out of desperation, you do out of, tshuva, out of tzaka, out of tefillah. But Tainus Esther is a commemoration of the power of prayer and the power of achdus, of unity, right? And the power of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hashgacha, his divine providence. So in that respect, Tainus Esther is not a violation of the rule that the day before and the day after, are excluded from a Tainus. All right. Anyway, so I hope that answers your question. Either way, let's get back to the main point, which is that the 14th, the idea of having a different day for the 14th and the 15th is unique. And as you correctly pointed out, and the Ramban is troubled by it. He's not so much troubled about the kfar. As I said, the kfar is just a technicality. Aside from Matanos Levionim, Mishloach Manos, the Suda, everything else, the real day is the 14th. But when it comes to the krach and it comes to the ear, it seems like it's two different discrete days. And where do we find such a thing? And this is how the Ramban raises the question. Ani tema ma'od, he says. Tema ma'od is a strong language. I'm very, astonished, says the Ramban. And by the way, the language of the Ramban is just beautiful language, as it always is. But it's also in the cadence a little bit of the tune of Kriyas HaMegillah, or it's in the pattern of the words of the Megillah, The Ramban did everything at a very high level, So listen to the language. Mara'u al kacha, uma higia alehem. That's like Megillah language. You can almost like break into the tune, the music of the Megillah. What were they thinking? Lasos Yisrael agudos b'mitzvah hazu, to make Klal Yisrael into two different camps to divide Klal Yisrael in their commemoration of Purim. Right? The Afal Gav, and by the way, this is what connects us with our limud of the year, Masachet Yevamos, the learning. The Afal Gav deleka hacha mishum losis godadu. There's a principle in the Torah called losis godadu, which Chazal understand to mean lotasu agudos agudos. Don't make yourself into discrete camps. Instead, there's a principle of mishpat echad yalachem. There should be one halacha for everybody, ideally. Certainly when they had an Anshe Knesset Agdola and they had Bezin Agadol, and they had the means to determine what the halacha is, so, they would make one ruling for all of Klal Yisrael, Mishpat Echad Yalachem. And that's why there was a prohibition, Lotasu Agudos Agudos. So the Gemara speaks about this in Yevamos, on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, because for those of you who are in our regular shir, for those of you who are not, don't worry about it, but for those of you who are, an extra little tidbit or treat, we noted that we've been learning Masechet Yevamos, the question of what happens when, a man dies childless, and the obligation that his brothers have, to continue his legacy and his family. That's the principle of Yibum. So there's a major debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. In the first Mishnah in Yevamos, as we've been discussing, Beis Hillel says that if the candidates for Yibum are erva, like a close relative, let's say somebody married their niece, right, and then died, and now the brother is a candidate for Yibum. So of course he can't do Yibum with his daughter. So the Mishnah says in that case that there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza, this is what we've been discussing, but there's also no Tsara, meaning if there's more than one wife, the co-wives are also excluded from Yibum and Chalitza. That's called Tsara Serva. And Beis Shammai and the Mishnah on Yud Gimel Amud Aleph disagrees. So the Gemara on Yud Gimel in Yevamos says, let's say you had a Bezdin you had a Bezdin in the city, and half of the Dayanim, half the judges, held like Beis Hillel and half held like Beis Shammai. That would be a big problem. That would be an example of lotis kodadu, lotasu agudos agudos. The Gemara then goes on to machlokus between Abai and Rabba. The Gemara goes on to say that what would happen if there were two different Batei Dinim but in one city. So the Gemara seems to think if there are two Batei Dinim in two different cities, that's never a problem. If there are two Batei Dinim in one city, that's a machlokas. And everybody agrees if there's one Bezdin in one city, but they're split, they can't come to a conclusion. That is a problem of losis kodus. So that's what the Ramban is referring to here when he says, "Afagav deleka hacha mishum lotis kodadu, the havale shnei batei dinim b'shtei ayaros k'diisa b'perakama diyavama." There's no technical problem of lotis kodadu because we're talking about what you do in a walled city and what you do in a regular, in an open city. So it is true that everybody's celebrating on a different day, but not in the same city. Mikol makom, says the Ramban, just because there isn't technical losis godadu, the principle of unity has been damaged. Mikol makom l'chatchila lama chilkum l'shtei kitos. Why would we by design create two different, we don't have it in any other holiday. Everybody admits Hanukkah's on the same day. Everybody has, Pesach and Shavuot.
For the Ramban, it's a little surprising that they should make such a big tema out of this because the Megillah says very clearly why we have two different days. Because Shushan was an enclosed city.
No, so that's historically true.
Huh?
Yeah, no, that's historically true, but they didn't have to structure the...
it was commemorative.
They didn't have to structure the observance, though. We'll see what the Ramban says. The Ode, then he continues, Heichon matzina b'Torah mitzvah chaluka b'kach. Where in the Torah do we ever find any other mitzvah which is broken up in this kind of way? Torah amra, Torah achas umishpat echad yelachem. Lest you say, oh, it's a rabbinic, not a biblical mitzvah, and therefore the rules of unity don't apply. That's not true either, because kol detikun rabbanan ke'ein doraisa.
Hey, Carmen, how you doing?
We missed you today.
So somewhere else, yeah.
When they legislate, a din d'Rabbanan, they usually pattern after a din d'Oraisa. So if there's typically uniformity or homogeneity in the dates and in the commemoration of a Yom Tov d'Oraisa, then the expectation would have been, notwithstanding the different experiences, we'll get that in a moment, that they find one date, whether it's the 15th or the 14th, and that across the board, that's the one that they commemorate and celebrate. So this is the question of the Ramban. Just to give you, before we get to the Ramban's answer, the problem of Lotus Godadu doesn't seem to be such a serious problem for another reason. If you look at the last Marmakom here, I have on page 7 and 8, I cited the Meshech Chachma, Reb Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, one of the great Talmidei Chachamim of the 19th century, contemporary of Reb Chaim, author of the Or Sameach and the Meshech Chachma. So he discusses this question, and he actually links it to the phrase Divrei Shalom ve'emet. If you look here on the bottom of page 7, he says, Dorshu b'Megillah, Dafei Amud Aleph, Zmano shel zeh lo kizmano shel zeh. That's the language that the Gemara uses, meaning Krachim, walled cities, and open cities would observe Purim on different days, one on the 14th, the other on the 15th. Uzmanim harbe tiknu lahem. And there are even more dates, if you're counting, Kriyas HaMegillah and the Kfarim, the villages, Yud Aleph, Yud Beis, Yud Gimel Kfarim, Ubivamos Parakama, Rami Reish Lakish, Shaksiv, Lo Tiskodadu, Lo Tasu, Agudos, Yu'in Sham B'Maskana. So he points out that if you look at the Ritva, Ayin Ritva, the Amos HaShayich Lo Tiskodadu, when do we have the prohibition that you shouldn't be agudos, that you shouldn't have two camps, and you should come to a resolution and shouldn't have two different piskei halacha? He says that's only in something like the example in Yevamos, where there's an argument between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, whether a co-wife is excluded from Yibum, a tzara is excluded from Yibum in circumstances where there is erva, there's a daughter or a mother-in-law or a stepmother, in the picture. Now that argument is not a policy argument. That argument is a legal argument about truth and falsehood, meaning Beis Hillel was of the firm conviction that when you exclude someone from the candidacy of Yibum, it affects not only them, but the whole Zik. And it affects the tzara as well. Again, I want to get deeply into Yevamos tonight. We'll get back to that in Yitzhak next week. But Beis Shammai thought that just because one candidate is excluded from Yibum, what does that have to do with the other candidates? So the argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is not a policy argument. It's not the Chachamim's decision what the best way to commemorate something is. It's a argument about truth. It's a halachic argument. It's a legal argument about truth and falsehood.
Well, maybe
the
that
right way to read the psukim, the right way to understand the rule.
maybe that answers the elephant in the room, which is Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios. How can there be a bigger example of agudas aguda than
no, but Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios is
it's not halachic. You just answered.
No, it is halachic, but it's halachic because the shliach Bezdin didn't reach the people, and they didn't know what day Rosh Chodesh was.
Still, you have half of Klal Yisrael celebrating Yom Tov, and the other one is doing malacha. No.
But no one's doing malacha, and no one's not celebrating on the real day. Just that there's a question, practically, of people in certain venues not knowing what the real day is. There's only one day of Yom Tov, right? The reason that in Chutz La'aretz, in Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golus, we have 2 days is because back in the time when there was Kiddush al
but still, the net result is
But the net result
You
is
don't
not
see
our
that more
concern.
clearly, not anymore, but years ago in Eretz Yisrael.
Right, but the net result
Today nobody
is not,
observes in Eretz Yisrael 2
the
days.
net result has nothing to do with Losis Go to do, because it has to do with Safek L'Chumra. And the net result is not something you can ask, like the Ramban is asking, why would Anshe Knesset Agdola, why would they Lichatchila, why would they ideally create this bifurcation? Because that's not what's going on in Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath. Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath is a practical, it's just like any other, let's say you have food in front of you, you don't know it's kosher food or non-kosher food, right? So you can't eat it until you find out. Safek l'chumra. So the origins of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath are Safek l'chumra. We're not sure whether Pesach is supposed to be on a Tuesday or Wednesday. That was decided by the new moon and the testimony in the Bezdin. And if outlying areas didn't find out in time, so they knew it was either Tuesday or Wednesday, but they didn't know which one. So they had to be careful. That's not a problem of Mishpat Echad Yalachem. In practice it is, but that's because of halachic rules about suffix. That's not comparable. But what the Ritva and the Meshach Chochmah are saying here is that Losis Godu is Tzoras Habas. Beis Shammai mechayvim b'yibum beis Hillel potrin. Nimsadal Tzoras Habas shel Beis Shammai yu beis Hillel omrim she'eshes ach v'havlad mamzer. Each one thought about the other one's psak, that it was totally wrong and that it violated the halacha because they were passionate about their. V'chein al shel Beis Hillel hay Beis Shammai omrim she shomeres yavam shenisat hashuk depligi bazed amar lo hava divrei Beis Hillel emes. Each one was saying about the other. They weren't calling each other names. The whole point of the Mishnah is that they were very respectful of each other, and they, tried to, figure out how they could move forward and marry each other despite this fundamental difference. But at the end of the day, the difference was a core legal argument about truth, about halachic truth. Avakan Megillah, says the Meshach Chochmah, hello, kuli alma modu de b'nei kfarim boile mikrobiyam haknisa. This is about policy. It's not about law. And in policy, everybody agrees that the way the Anshe Knesset Agdola set it up was that if you live in a small village, you're going to do the 11th, the 12th, occasionally the 13th. Ubnei krachim b'tesvav, ubnei ayaros b'yadalid. Ulakulu kedin of dinan, everyone's doing the right thing. No one is saying about the other one that they are. This is quite brilliant. He says, "V'zet teretz maspik, ukein zeh kosav orzarua." This is what the Ritva and Orzarua say. But then he adds, "V'kotev hasvara," like the essential logic here is, "Imchad minon av sheker l'divrei chavero." If there's an argument about legal truth, so that's something that can fragment the halachic world and create like two Torahs. That's what we say as Zaken Mamre, by the way, a rebellious elder. He starts off as a conscientious objector, but we have no tolerance for his refusal to acquiesce to the majority opinion once, it's established that that's what the opinion is, because he's wreaking havoc on the unity of Klal Yisrael, making it kishtei Toros, arguing, because they're arguing about a truth and a falsehood, and there has to be a mechanism to come to a proper conclusion. So Abel Khan, right, shelakol echad chavero also kedin amiti, but when it comes to the 14th and 15th day of Purim, everybody is in agreement what the obligation is for an open city and for a walled city. Mashayich kan lo tisko to do. So very brilliantly, he adds, V'zeh Amar vayishlach sfarim, that when, Mordechai and Esther established Purim, they sent out, these, they publicized it. They sent out publications or notifications, and it was Divrei Shalom ve'emes. So he says that the phrase Divrei Shalom ve'emes, says the Meshach Chochmah, means that this wasn't a controversy. It wasn't an argument about law. It was a decision, right, about shalom, it was a peaceful decision, which everybody, she shalom l'kula. The emes, שכל אחד עושה כאמס, לקיימס ימי הפורים האלו בזמניהם, היינו בזמנים הרבה שתקנו להם, דלקה משום בל תסגודדו. So that's a brilliant read of those words at the end of the Megillah. It's almost as if the way the Meshech Chochmah is saying it, based on the principle of the Or Zarua and the Ritva, the distinction between a legal argument and a policy decision to diffuse, the observance, the commemoration of the days. So he's saying, actually, in his reading and in his rendering of the psukim themselves are kind of telling you that they decided to go for divrei shalom, the emet, as if to justify the dual perspective. So that is the reasoning of the Meshech Chochmah. The Rav Kook, Zecharna Livracha, in a book that was published by Rav Neria that I saw once picked up, called Moadei HaRiyah, as Divrei Torah from Rav Kook on the various Moadim. So he addresses this question. He has a very interesting other suggestion. He points out that the creation of the holiday of Purim itself was not such a simple matter, in the sense that you can't just decide to create a new holiday, right? We know that this was a big issue both in Hanukkah and in Purim. You might be encroaching on the problem of Baltosif, which is that you can't, you can't create new halacha, and maybe a new holiday. This is what the Ramban in Parshas Vo'ez Chanon, on the pasuk of Lo Sosei for Lo Sigra. So the Ramban says that, when a person on his own, we're not talking about Anshe Knesset Agdola, we're talking about an individual decides, I want to make a new holiday. It's called Bodeh, Bodeh Davar Milibo. Like he'll say L'Shem Shemayim. He's like, drunk with his love of the Rabbanu Shalom, and he wants to create a new ritual or a new holiday. He wants to be Bodeh Chag Milibo. Says the Ramban, it's very possible that he is encroaching on the rule of Lo Tosef or Lo Tigra, that you're not allowed to be Mosif. So Rav Kook has a very interesting suggestion. He says, maybe, because Hanukkah and Purim are sent, there are other solutions to this problem. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the Rambam explains in his very brief introduction to the Minyan HaKotzar in Yad HaChazaka, the Rambam says that Purim and Hanukkah, were formulated as holidays midrabanan, or divrei sofrim, or divrei Kabbalah. And, there was no suggestion that they were biblical holidays. And for that reason, there's no problem about Baltosif. This is consistent with the Rambam's view in Hilchos Mamrim, where he also says that, the Rambam says, if somebody, saying that chicken, basar oaf, is going to be treated as meat, is not Baltosif, because you're not saying that it's Minatori, you're saying that this is a din d'Rabbanan. Whenever you admit something is d'Rabbanan, the Rambam says that's not Baltosif. So that's how he explains that Hanukkah, Purim, these are not Baltosif, holidays, at all. But what Rav Kook was trying to suggest is an interesting idea, and that is, people could think that this is a problem of Baltosif. So a mechanism to, to underscore that this isn't a biblical holiday. It's almost like the Ramban, the opposite of what the Ramban rejected. The Ramban said, maybe, since it's not a biblical holiday, so there's no problem of fragmenting it or diffusing it across different days. Says the Ramban, what happened to Kol Drabanan Kein Doraisa Tikun? So, but Rav Kook basically was suggesting, no, they dafka wanted it not to look like a Doraisa because they wanted to shield it from the, misconception that this is a violation of Baltosif. Okay. Anyways, the Ramban himself gives two other suggestions, the first of which the Ran mostly likes, second of which he doesn't, but which I think are very significant. But before we get to that, I want to establish one other point very clearly, hopefully clearly. And that is, what is the relationship between these 2 days halachically? Okay, we don't have so much time, but let me just speak for a few minutes about this question. So if you look at the Gemara, and this will help us for the Ramban also. If you look at the Gemara on the Beis Amud Beis, which I have here on page 1. So the Gemara wants to know, how do you know that that the walled cities celebrated on the 15th and that the open cities celebrated on the 14th? Like, how do you know that? So the Gemara says here on page 1, how do you know this? So the Gemara says, Amar Rava de Amar Kra, al kain haYehudim aprazim hayoshvim ba'area prazos. The pasuk says, therefore, explaining after the battle, how they wanted to commemorate the people who lived in open cities, right? They observed the 14th. So the diuk is midiprazim ba'arba'asar. It says the prazim, the people in open cities, observed or commemorated the 14th. The implication is that mukafim, that cities that were walled, b'chamisha asar, they celebrated on the 15th. So that, okay, good. That's how we know this bifurcation. Says the Gemara, this is an amazing Gemara. Listen to these lines in the Gemara. Now again, the next 3 suggestions of the Gemara are only suggestions. In the end, they get rejected. However, my view always is that even a suggestion that that is considered in the Gemara, may echo a certain perspective and truth. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ema prazim ba'arba'asar mukafim klal lo." Wow. The Gemara says maybe people who lived in walled cities, maybe they shouldn't observe Purim at all. Who says they get the diuk was that the pasuk says that the people in the prazim and the open cities, they celebrated on the 14th. The implication being, as opposed to the walled cities, what do? It must have been the 15th. Says the Gemara, maybe it wasn't at all. Maybe they couldn't celebrate on the 14th because that wasn't the day in which the experience, would have justified, a celebration. And since they couldn't celebrate on the 14th, maybe they shouldn't celebrate at all. Wow. Meaning, this would be a strong statement that there can only be one day, A, and then B, that one day can only be the day of the 14th, even though, when you think about it, and this is something I want to get back to, which experience, we'll call it, was more central to the story and to the history, maybe there's a difference, and to the commemoration of Purim? The story of Shushan or the story of other cities? So you would have thought, I would have thought, for sure Shushan. And that is the view of some. I mean, in the mission of the first day, that's the first observance that's mentioned, is Shushan, is Ikrachim, the 15th. I mean, all the television cameras and the social media and everything else, all the action, the seat of government, Achashverosh and Esther and Mordechai and Haman and, the newspapers, the New York Post of Shushan, or maybe even worse, the New York Times. It was all Shushan.
But even in Shushan, it was only the aftermath, the need for the second day, that created the Shushan. But they also had the first day.
No, that is true. That is true. But we're trying to figure out.
In other words, the real ness occurred the first day, and then they had to sweep up the balance.
Right, but somehow the Noach Lahem, which is what they're celebrating, was only on the 15th.
Correct.
And but what I'm trying to explain, I think you missed for a minute, is the line in the Gemara that says maybe everybody who can should celebrate on the 14th, meaning people in open cities, because they had that experience, and the people in the Krachim shouldn't celebrate at all. Not that they should celebrate on the 14th.
So then what do you do with the prozim?
No, the Prozim are celebrating on the 14th. It's the Krachin, the Gemara is saying maybe they shouldn't celebrate at all.
Why
What do you
shouldn't
mean they shouldn't
Why
celebrate at
shouldn't they
all? So,
celebrate at all? They're part of Klal Yisrael.
so that's the next line of the Gemara. That's good. But until you get to the next line of the Gemara, what were they thinking? The answer,
Yeah.
what they were thinking was that the experience of the 14th as the day of celebration was for Prazim. They're not going to have 2 days because that's a problem, right? And if you have to choose to have only one
So the
day,
Jews in the little
then you're going
village.
to choose the 14th. I'm just pointing out that choosing the 14th for the Prazim and ignoring the Krachim is a remarkable. No one ever talks about this.
I mean, so the Jews on the
It's a very
in the Krachim.
What would be so bad if everyone kept the same day?
no, it
Why would
wouldn't
that be so terrible?
We're going to get to that in the next line. At this time, the Gemara
Okay.
was thinking that since the people in the Krachim, right, only rested and finished their war on the 15th, they can't. I'll explain for the Ramban more in a minute, but they can't celebrate on the 14th at this point in the Gemara. And therefore, it's either 15th or nothing, and there's only one day, and the main day is the 14th, so they won't celebrate at all. So then the next line in the Gemara is V'lav Yisrael Ninu, which is what you asked. Like what you're gonna, which also is amazing. The Gemara is saying, forget about experiences and forget about Ikar and Tafel. Every member of Klal Yisrael has to celebrate Purim. There has to be an
It says in the
inclusion.
Megillah that this was the edict of Mordechai and Esther, that for all generations.
The Gemara is examining what they really said and what they didn't. We know how we interpreted Lamaskana of the Gemara. That's not fair, right? So then the Gemara says, V'lav Yisrael Ninu. I'll show you how the Ramban adds to this in a minute. And then the Gemara says, V'od behod of Yad Kush Ksiv. I mean, the whole gamut, whether it was an open city or a walled city. But what did the Gemara originally think? What they originally thought was, there's only one day, not two, no matter what. And if you have to choose a day, right, it's going to be the 14th, not the 15th, even if that excludes the people in Shushan, even though the cameras were only rolling and all the decisions were being made, everything was happening in Shushan. So what's the yichus of Yadal?
Actually,
I'm going to show you in a minute
the
that
precedent.
the Ramban
Actually,
is of just 1 second, that the Ramban is of the opinion that the Prazim were in greater danger. I'll show you this inside just a second. And that the Prazim were the majority of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael.
But actually, there's a precedent for the fact that if you don't make it, you lose it. Because we needed the whole halach of Pesach Sheni to come out in the Torah to tell us that those poor people who couldn't make it, they were tamei for the Korban Pesach, that they get a second chance. Otherwise, it goes tough luck. I mean, if you don't fit into the date, you lose it. So that
right, but it's just very.
It's one thing. Not so off base.
It's one thing to say that the several individuals, Nebuch, he can't, if they don't follow the regimen, they can't be included in the Korban Pesach. It's quite another thing to say that in the capital city, where Haman and Esther and Mordechai and Achashverosh and the New York Times, everybody was with all this thing was happening, and the poor and everything. That's the day that's going to be, and that's the population that you're going to exclude. That's a remarkable thing. Now, again, it ends up that we don't say that. But why would you say that in Havamina? So I'll just show you in the Ramban. Just take a minute. Go back to the Ramban for a moment. The first idea that the Ramban mentions, this is a very remarkable Ramban, is he says, it's about experience, like what you wanted to say before, namely, the experience of the Yudalid people, of the Prazim people, was that they celebrated on Yudalid, and the experience of the Krachim people was that they celebrated on Tesvav. That's the first thing the Ramban says. We go back to the Ramban now on page 5. He says, V'shemi yesh lomar shenasa nes b'shushan b'yudalad v'noach lahem haya b'chamisha asar kavu l'chamisha asar yom b'yom she'tchilu bo u'lefi she'ikar hanes haya b'shushan. This is his original idea. The main nes was in Shushan. That's where all the principles were. That's where everything was being unfolding. So kavi moim kobos hanechbadim dainu krachin amukafim. V'shar kol hayaros shaya hanes shalahem b'yud gimel ונוח שלהם בי"ד, קבעו ביום שלהם שהתחילו כדרך שהעירו להם, כך קבעו some, meaning, this is a din, whatever it is, they did it according to the experiences of the two different populations. And then he says, Ein tam ze matok v'tov b'einai. I'm not happy with this. So what does he say instead? So he goes almost in the opposite direction. Listen to this. Number one, like Jacob said before, the main nace even for Shushan was on the 13th when they were fighting. Yom Tov, Im Kol Yisrael. So what's the big deal? Why couldn't they make one day and let them be included in Yudalid together with all of Kol Yisrael together? Okay, so that year, as it happens, they had an extra day, but they also benefited from the first day. And also, this is the key, Rov Klal Yisrael were in big cities that were open, and their Nace and their Yeshua was revolved around Yudalid. Osha Shushan Yom Tov Yudalid V'Tesvav. Or maybe Shushan should celebrate.
Also, the Gezerah was on Yud Gimel.
By the way, now just hold on to the place there, but go back to the Gemara for a moment. What's the next line in the Gemara? The Gemara says, V'lav Yisrael, they knew. The Od Mehodo says, the Gemara says, Ema Prazim Bar Besar, Mukafin Bar Besar B'Chamesar. The Gemara has a suggestion. The Gemara says, maybe for the Pidipol in the big cities that were open, they celebrate Purim one day. And for the people in the Krachin, they should celebrate, they should have a 2-day Yontif. Kidesiv lios osimis yom arba asar lechodesh adar, ve'es yom chamisha asar bo, b'chol shana. Says the Gemara, ihav eksiv es yom arba asar v'chamisha asar, if it didn't add the words ve'es yom chamisha asar, kidakamras, we would have thought that the Krachin people celebrate 2 days, and the Ayaros people celebrate 1 day. But Hashad Ksivas Yom Arba Asar Ves Yom Chamisha Asar Asaat Upasik Hani Barbasar Hani Bechamisha Asar. So then the Gemara says something even more remarkable. The Ema Prazim Barbesar Mukafini Ba'u Barbesar Iba'u Bechamesar. Maybe what we should do is if we should have a third Shita. Remember, the first Shita was the Krachim don't celebrate at all. That's remarkable. The second Shita was the Krachim celebrate 2 days. That's the opposite, right? Now the third Shita is something in between. The Arim celebrate on the 14th. The Krachim get to choose if they want to celebrate with the 14th or they want to celebrate on the 15th. The Gemara says, why not? The answer is Amar Kra.
Against Aguda, I mean, that would be.
So imagine that you're thinking about that even. Amar Kra bizmanehem. Zmano shelzeh, lo zmano shelzeh. The diuk is, no, dafka should be discrete and not even a choice, or it should be 2 days. It shouldn't be a choice of days. It should be them 14, them 15, and never the twain shall meet. Wow. How far do we take this bizmano shelzeh, eno zmano shelzeh? This is a big, big argument before I get back to the I'll give you a couple of examples. I'm not going to do inside because it's getting late. So I'll give you 2 examples. One is something I think we talked about last year in a little bit of a different way, I think, or maybe 2 years ago. And that is the question of Bar Chiyuva, right? Not everybody knows how to read the Megillah. By the way, that's the reason that we say you don't read the Megillah on Shabbos, because not everybody knows how to read the Megillah. We're worried that people get excited and they'll forget that it's Shabbos, and if there's no Eruv, they'll pick up the Megillah and go to somebody to have him read it for them or teach them, and they'll violate this Shabbos. Just like Shofar and Lulav, right? So too Megillah. That's why we don't have Kriyas Megillah on Shabbos. So the big idea is this. Not everybody knows how to read the Megillah. Let's say the expert Megillah reader, right, is from a different time zone. I don't mean, Central Time, Eastern Time, Israel Time. I don't mean that. I mean a different day of obligation than the people who need to hear from him.
Then he can't
That
read
can
it.
happen in 2 different ways. Let's say Farim, right? Or Yudalit and Tesvav.
Well, then
So,
he
for
can't-
example, let's say
he
the
has to be
expert.
Bar Chiyuv himself in order to read it for other people. That's a classic halachic fact. I can't
Correct.
read for you if I'm not chayiv, if I don't at least have the same.
You have to be a
obligation.
bar chiyuva, but there are two questions here. The principle is that if you're not a bar chiyuva, if you're not obligated, you can't be motzi acher midei chavasa. That's what you just said,
Right.
and that's correct. That's 100%
Tradition
correct.
Rosh Hashanah.
However, there's some complexity here, and that's why this is a major discussion in the Talmud Yerushalmi. I'm just going to give you a little taste of it. If you look on the bottom of page 2, you have the Beis HaBechira LaMeiri, the Masachet Megillah Yud Tes Amud Aleph, number Hey, on bottom of page 2. Okay, so the Yerushalmi discusses this question. Can a ben krach read for a ben ir? Can a ben ir read for a ben kvar? Right? And vice versa. The problem with Yerushalmi is the problem of many Yerushalmis. And that is that, we don't have the same kind of tradition in reading Yerushalmis as we do in Bavlis. And we don't always know what it says. So in this case, there's a major debate among the commentaries of the Yerushalmi, including the medieval Rishonim. If you look at the Rajba, the Mordechai, the Ritva, the Orzarua, the Meiri, everybody has a different read on the Yerushalmi. Okay? So the Ritva and the Rajba basically say, listen, a Bar Chiyuva has a very limited, very strict meaning. Meaning, if you're a Ben Krach, you can't read for the people on Yodalid. And if you're a Ben Ir, you can't read for the people on Tesvav.
But
The only thing is,
question
one
is
second.
where they're doing it.
What?
The question is where they're doing it. Are they doing it in a
No,
class?
in the right place. Let's say you're having the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, which is in New York City, right? It's not a krach, so they lane the Megillah on the 14th.
True.
Correct. And let's say, but in Yerushalayim, right? They lane 15th.
Yeah.
Or Shushan, right? Okay.
It
So
is possible that
wait 1 second. Just give me 1 second. Let me just let's at least just analyze the case. So let's say you have a better or only Balkore for the Fifth Avenue Synagogue's Kriya is a Yerushalmi who's also going home and is going to be home for the 15th. Can he read can he read on the 14th? Or can somebody who observed on the 14th?
No, you're saying because he's a shliach for the tzibur? You're saying because he's a shliach for the tzibur, Rabbi?
Everybody's talking at the same time. You have to take one.
Because he's a shliach for the tzibur, so he has to be mechuyev on your day. Is that where you're going?
That's the principle. The principle is you have to be a bar chiyuva in order to be motzi. However, this is the problem. There are two issues. There are two subtle issues. One is typically when we say you need to be a bar chiyuva to be motzi acher midei chavasan, what we mean by that is like you can't be a katan, or you can't be somebody who, like a woman who's not obligated.
No, you also have to be the
can't
same
be
as
motzi a
regular.
man. A
You have to be the
katan
same as
who's not
regular.
obligated cannot be motzi a gadol. But what if you have people who are obligated in the same mitzvah, but the details of their obligation are different, like different times? Is that a problem?
Right.
So doesn't it make it?
That's interesting.
That is question
Good
number
question.
1. Question number 2 is to what extent is there a big gap between the obligation of these different time periods? So I'll just give you the example. The Ritva and the Rajba say, and then I promise I'll take all questions. The Ritva and the Rajba say, listen, there's a difference between a Ben Ir reading for a Kvar and a Ben Krach reading for a Ben Ir.
Right.
Meaning, the Ben Ir and the Ben Kvar are really obligated on the same day. It's just the implementation is earlier in the Kvar. So the Ritva and the Rajba say a Ben Ir can read for a Ben Kvar on Yud Aleph, on Yud Beis, on Yud Gimel, because everybody in the Kvar really is obligated on the 14th, and it's just a special takana of how, that's why the Suda and the Shloach Manos is going to be on the 14th. They're really all part of the same obligation. However, says the Ritva and the Rashba, a Ben Krach who's obligated on the 15th can't read for in the ear, and a Ben Ear who's obligated on the 14th cannot read in a Krach.
But is that exactly the same?
One second. Just give me one more second. The Mordechai disagrees. The Mordechai says, no, a Ben Krach can read for Ben Ear can read for Ben Krach. It's all good. The Meiri, I want to read on the bottom of page, what did I say? What page is this? Page 2. The Meiri says as follows. Whoever is a bar chiyuva, whoever is obligated, can also be the shliach tzibor, if you will, for others. Me'ata shalu b'talmud amarav. That's why in the Yerushalmi they ask the question: Ben Ir ma'u sheyotzi ben krach ma'u sheyotzi ben Ir. What about a 15, Adar guy being motzi a 14th, or vice versa? The Heshivu Ben Ir ein motzi ben krach. The Ben Ir cannot serve as a shliach tzibor of Kriyas HaMegillah in the krach. Sharei niftar lo, he's already finished his obligation, and he has no real connection to the 15th. Upaka mimenu chovas Megillah. However, says the Meiri, this is the Meiri Lishitaso, Ben Krach Motzi Ben Ir, the 15th obligated individual can read for the ear, even though technically his time has not yet come. This is the sheet of the Meiri.
I would have seen it exactly the opposite.
The Meiri said, just one second, the Meiri is of the opinion, I'm going to read you the Meiri earlier. V'nira li hatam, this is the third Gimel on the same page. Shakrachim l'rov chashivusam roi lahem l'smoach b'shnei hayamim. Because of the significance of what happened in the Krachim, really it should have been a 2-day read. Like the Havamim of the Gemara. However, if we told them to read on 14th, we wouldn't be able to sustain the excitement for the second day. It's like, Yonta Sheni Shel Golios. It's hard to keep it up. Kvar kol sa simcha achar she'avar yom ikar hanes. Avol k'shakorim b'tezvav. But if we told them only to read on the 15th, they're not really excluded from the 14th. We're just holding back their obligation to make sure that the additional dimension gets expressed. But the 14th is Tchilas Hanes v'ikaro k'moshe yizbar. Avol kfarim vayaros lo hitrichom elayom echad. This is the Meiri Lishitasa. So the Meiri says, if a Tesvav person is really obligated also on Yudalid, a Yudalid person is not obligated on Tesvav, and therefore, from a Bar Chiyuva perspective, there are really two issues in Bar Chiyuva. Number one, right, we're not talking about a Katan or somebody who's not Mechuyev in the mitzvah. We're just talking about a difference in detail, which day. Number two, even in the difference of details, even if you're Lemaisa having the Krach on the 15th and the ear on the 14th, to what extent is each one excluded from the other? There are two statements in the Gemara. One statement is, and then I'll take the questions, is Zmano Shalzeh, Eino Zmano Shalzeh, which we read in the Gemara before. What that means is the takana that they made was two different discrete days, a day for the Krachim, a day for the Ayaros. But there's another statement that the Gemara has, and that is Le'asor Shalzeh Bazeh, Bazeh, Bazeh. What does that mean? What that means is, when it comes to Hesped and Tainus, Tachnun, right? We don't say it on Purim and we don't say it on Shushan Purim. And the people in the Krach don't say it on Shushan Purim and they don't say it on Yom Yadalit either. Meaning, on the one hand, there's discreteness. Each community has its own celebration. On the other hand, there's overlap. And there's a debate among the Rishonim, how much overlap is there for the Bnei Krach regarding Yudal? Now, before I get back to the Ramban and the punchline of all this, and what I think its implications are for us, I want to take it seems like there are some questions. So let's take
it seems that the logic may be the other way around, because the person in the Krach cannot read in the ear because he's not Mitzvah at that point yet. He's not commanded. The one in the ear.
Well, he's only not commanded if you think that there's a total discrete obligation. If you hold like the Meiri and the other indications.
That's the simpler reading. So let's just follow the simple approach. Okay.
Well, that's the Ritva and the Ra'ah and the Ritva and
the one in the ear. The one in the ear, he was mitzvah. He missed the opportunity. So he may have a miluim, he may have some. He's still commanded. So
well, he didn't necessarily miss the opportunity. Are you going to distinguish whether he missed the opportunity or not?
No, in other words,
the Yerushalmi isn't talking about somebody who
became mitzvah on the 14th. Okay, so he already reached that degree of mitzvah. Okay,
right.
So now the question is, can he also do it on the 15th? That's one hurdle to overcome.
Well,
but
obviously that
was never mitzvah yet. So for him, who's not mitzvah yet, to be able to read to those who are mitzvah, that becomes a big problem.
Well, you could say it that way. The Meiri is saying it the opposite way. The Meiri is saying, right, the Meiri is saying like this.
You could see it the other way.
No, you could, but the Meiri is saying exactly the opposite. What he's saying is as follows: the person who is obligated on the 15th is really obligated already from the 14th. Just we've withheld his obligation because we knew that if we allowed him to express himself on the 14th, there wouldn't be much left for the 15th. And therefore, artificially, we delayed his experience to the 15th, but really his obligation begins with Rov Klal Yisrael on the 14th. The person who is obligated on the 14th, he fulfilled his, or even if he didn't, either he fulfilled it or he didn't fulfill it, but that was his day to fulfill it. And the day of the 15th is less shaykh to him than the day of the 14th is to the B'nai Krach. Anyways, this is a very fascinating issue. But what the Ramban ends up saying, go back now to the Ramban. The Ramban says, this is what I think is going on. He says, Ein tam ze matok v'tov b'einai, lefi shaya ikar anes l'shushan atzmo b'yom gimel, v'hinoi ra'ui sheyelem yom yudalid Yom Tov im Kol Yisrael. Really, really, like the Gemara's Havamina, and like some of you said, even the Krach people, like, why isn't the 14th their main day? The Meiri thinks it is their main day. The Meiri's answer to this question is, we couldn't sustain the excitement, so we, withheld the obligation. Okay, but the Ramban doesn't say that. So Ramban says the Ikar Nes for everybody was the victory on Yud Gimel and the celebration on Yud Dal, right? And that would have been, and this is key, that would have been a celebration im Kol Yisrael, together with all of Klal Yisrael. Afal pisha osu b'shnas hanes Yom Tov b'tesvav. Notwithstanding the fact that the experience in that year was that they only could rest and enjoy and celebrate on the 15th. Oshiyeli Shushan Yom Tov b'yadalid b'tesvav. Like the Havamin and Gemara Hovanas Bemnes. He says, however, Ukashiyanti Biksuvim, the Siashivli Ha'inu Yafa. Ramban says, I took another look at the Psukim in the Megillah, and I realized something quite astonishing. Lefi, Shehu Davar Barur, Shebizmano Shalnei Zek, Kvar Nifkedu Yisrael Ve'olo La'aretz. There are those who disagree with the Ramban historically, including the Ran. The Ramban is suggesting that the majority of Jews in the time of the miracle of Purim already lived in Eretz Yisrael. V'olu b'rishyon korash v'nisyashvu b'areya. Omar Haman, 1 second. Yeshno am echad mefuzar u'meforad beinu amim. B'kol makom anshe knesses hagdola im rov Yisrael ba'aretz hayu.
I mean,
the
that flies in the face of the whole story of Ezra.
No, so he says that's the
struggling to get people to come to Eretz Yisrael. The Shomronim are in Eretz Yisrael. I mean,
so he addresses that. V'shuvlo olim ba'im ela ma'atim im Ezra. His take is, from then on, the floodgates didn't, continue to open. That's how he's addressing it. But you're right, the Ran doesn't like that point. This is the main thing. So the Ramban says, even though the television cameras and the internet was all going on in Shushan, the people in the greatest danger were not the Jews of Shushan. They were the Jews in the open cities. That's where the majority of Jews were. Those are the ones in Eretz Yisrael. They had very little protection or protexia. And in a real way, the real sakana and the real Yeshua was not where the cameras were. It was in the rest of the Jewish world. I'm skipping to the next paragraph very quickly. Yom Yudalid Simcha Mishnah V'Yom Tov. Avam Kofin Lo Asu Klum. This is an amazing ha'ara of the Ramban. Ramban says if you read the Megillah, it doesn't say that the year later the Prozim and the Mukafin celebrated Purim. Certainly not on distinct days. It doesn't even say that the Mukafim celebrated at all. It says a year later, after the joyous victory and celebration, on the first anniversary, right? The Megillah says the Prozim, the people who are living in the cities without walls, says the Ramban, they initiated a celebration on the anniversary of their Hatzalah, only them. The people who are in Shushan and the other walled cities who are in less danger, according to the Ramban, they didn't even join. Lo asu klum. Lefi shehaya hanes hagadol beprazim. V'haya aleim asakana yoser kidafrishus. V'zeh shekasuv al kena Yehudim aprazim ayoshim b'arei aprazo osim yom yodalid the chodesh adar simchu mishnah v'lo huskiru kan mukafim klal. It's a radical but very precise
it flies in the face of the words of the Megillah. Flies in the face of the words of the Megillah.
No, it doesn't.
Make it appear that Esther and Mordechai proclaimed that these days should forever be days of.
That's that's after. You're jumping ahead too much. The Ramban knew how to read the Megillah too. Now that's the next paragraph. Achar zman la'achar sheheira kodesh baruch hu einayim umatzu smach min haTorah omad Mordechai ubeis dino v'ro divrayim shel prazim. Then, after that first anniversary, the Rabbanu Shalom illuminated to Anshe Knesset Hagdola, including Mordechai and Esther, right? And they realized v'kavu osal kol klal Yisrael shekulan hayu b'safek v'roi lahaktim prazim lemukafim sheyanisam gadol v'shem b'tchila b'mitzvah tchila laslos lahem levadam yom tov lefikach kavu yom tov. I'll explain in a minute. Shel Yom Tov shel prazim biyoman v'shehei miyuchad lahem v'shel mukafim kavu biyom noach shel Shushan. So this is the Ramban's take. By the way, as I said, the Ran is not happy with some of the historical elements of the Ramban's.
So the Ramban is saying that even though there was this humongous miracle, we know that even if you have a personal miracle, you're supposed to make a zecher for it and on every year when it happens. So we had this humongous miracle where the entire Jewish population was saved, and Mordechai didn't figure out by himself that there has to be a commemoration of some sort.
Correct. The initiative was taken, if you read the Psukim, by the people in the Prazim cities. The Ramban's diuk is that the Mukafim people didn't even join on that first year, but the reason is because as the Ramban puts it in his read, the real Hatzalah, the public nace was in Shushan. But the true vulnerability of the Jewish community was A, the community in Eretz Yisrael, B, the people living in cities without walls were technically, militarily, they were more vulnerable. Says the Ramban, for that reason, the Ikar day of Yeshua is reserved for the Prazim, for the people who are most vulnerable and most sensitive, as reflected by taking the initiative in making this a long-term commemoration and celebration. And the people in the Mukafim, even though that's where the movie cameras were, and that's where the pivotal events were taking place. Nonetheless, the danger there was less. The hashgacha of the Ribono Shel Olam was less needed in Shushan and in the Mukafos Choma than in the Prazim, and therefore the diffusion or the discreteness of the celebration of Purim across 2 days was intended to underscore these two different experiences. When it comes to the vulnerability of Klal Yisrael be'eretz Yisrael, and when it comes to the greater vulnerability of a Jewish community that is in greater danger, even if, right, all of the attention is focused on a community that is less in need, in the end of the day, the commemoration of the Yeshua highlights the vulnerable and the group that represents all of Klal Yisrael. Basically, according to the Ramban, there were 3 groups. There were the people in the Prazim, who, although it was more subtle and more providential, right, were the ones in greatest danger and the ones who had the greatest appreciation for that hashgacha, and therefore they took the lead, and they're the ones for whom the 14th, the day of Ikar Hanes and Hasimcha, is reserved. Then comes the ones, again, where it all took place in Shushan, who also were in danger, but not quite on the same acute level. And that's, of course, Mukafim, the days of those who were Mukaf Mukoma. And then, says the Ramban, there were also other Jews in the world who weren't in danger at all. However, that goes back to the line in the Gemara where the Gemara says, Atu elu einam Yehudim. It's inconceivable that when we commemorate a nes and a hatzalah that takes place primarily in Eretz Yisrael or primarily to the entire Jewish community, it's inconceivable that all Jews would not participate in that particular commemoration. So the Ramban's understanding explains that it's not agudos agudos, and it's not a violation of Mishpat Echad Yolachem, and it's not, a b'diavad. It's not only an extension of the experience of each community. It's more than that. There's a subtle understanding that even in an eis tzara, even in a time of crisis, that there's a difference between what everybody thinks is going on sometimes and more subtly, behind the scenes, where the greater Yeshua lies. And of course, I'm speaking about this. I think it's an objectively interesting topic and it's always relevant. But of course, it's much more relevant in the experience that we are undergoing right now. In some respects, except that the clarity, the Ramban's subtle distinctions and his fascinating perspective make our situation so much clearer because there's not even any confusion or subtlety whatsoever. Right now we're experiencing, a terrible, time of crisis for all of Klal Yisrael. There are people in the world, strewn across, the United States and Europe, and who may not think that they're, that this is relevant to them or that they're in danger. There are Jews out there, remarkably, who don't even understand, the facts of the, of the attack and the implications of it, and are all too quick, to disassociate themselves, from the Jewish community. The words of Mordechai, to Esther, ring very loudly, in the ears when we think about that part of the Jewish community, a small part, I hope, that is completely insensitive to the implications of everything that is happening. But I think most of us recognize that, the attack on October 6th was something, 7th, sorry, was an attack on all Jews. But of course, we have a tendency, and of course the resurgence of anti-Semitism and the exposure of how much latent anti-Semitism has always been here, and the vitriol and the distortions, in media and everything else, really highlight in a very dramatic way, what it is that all of world Jewry is confronting, and that is reflected in the present circumstances. And there's been a lot of discussion about anti-Semitism on the campuses and the implications of people's responses, Jews and non-Jews. And all of that is true. But sometimes, we in America, tend to become very inward and very focused, on our own situation. Our problems are a derivative, obviously, of the main issue, and that is what's going on in Eretz Yisrael, of course, where there's an existential crisis, and where Klal Yisrael is fighting for its core, security, so that even when there's so much going on and it can be confusing, it's important on the one hand to understand that Atu Elu Lav Yehudim Ninu, that there are no Jews in the world who are unaffected by the attacks on Eretz Yisrael and world Jews. Those who think that they're good Jews, and that if they protest and sing loud enough about the river to the sea, or whatever other slogans are being thrown around, that somehow this isn't about them. But what the Ramban is telling us is it's about, as the language of the Megillah is, Kol HaYehudim, whether or not you acknowledge it or you don't. At the same time, it's really about life in Eretz Yisrael, which is the national life of the Jewish people. That's why, even though there are those who historically disagree with the Ramban, that most of the Jews at this time were living in Eretz Yisrael, the Ran and others say they just think it's historically wrong. But I think the idea of the Ramban, which is that the cities in Eretz Yisrael were open cities, and the Jews in that part of the empire were in great danger, that was of great significance. We say that, there's no Hallel on Purim because it's a nation b'chutz la'aretz. At the same time, even, Krochim HaMukafim, because of Kvodan Shel Eretz Yisrael, is defined by the time period of Yehoshua ben Nun. And that Yerushalmi says, because, if you're going to celebrate, if you're going to mark a Hatzalah of Klal Yisrael, and you're going to celebrate a Simcha, for the Hashgacha of Klal Yisrael, then Eretz Yisrael has to be a part of that. Mishum Kvodan Shel Eretz Yisrael. That's just, sine qua non. That's just ABC. And that's on the Mukafim part. But according to the Ramban, the population in Eretz Yisrael were actually, they weren't in the public glare, but it's important to know, who was most vulnerable and most exposed, and where the Ikar Nes, really was. And therefore, the decision of how to commemorate this remarkable manifestation of divine providence that we call Purim was a rule-breaking one. It was, to separate or to diffuse it across 2 days, so that you could, acknowledge the two different experiences, but also in the right proportion, the experiences of the people in the open cities, who needed, Hatzalah, whose exposure was greater, and the exposure in Shushan, where the critical decisions, and the drama, was actually, unfolding. So by the Anshe Knesset Gdola, by, saying Zmano Shel Zeh, Eino Zmano Shel Zeh, but at the same time saying, Ha'asur Bazeh Hu Asur Bazeh, acknowledging both the overlap and the commonality, even as, they focus on the difference, really highlighted not only the different experiences of the different communities, but a hierarchy and in our appreciation, of how, initially, sadly, and in the end, in the case of Purim, joyously, sometimes trials and tribulations of Am Yisrael, how they ultimately, get sorted out through divine providence. So as we, continue to struggle and, express our concern through tefillah and activism, and and those in Eretz Yisrael by the ultimate sacrifice, sending their children, and not all of them return, tragically, to fight this war. We should, be particularly appreciative of, both the Purim of Yudalid and the Purim of Tesvav. Both of them are important. It's important to understand their differences, and, the different emphasis that they have, but of course the overlap as well. So I want to show everybody a Simchas Purim, and we'll continue
may I make
regular share in
Happy Purim, Rabbi. Thank you.
Happy
Okay.
Purim.
Happy
Thank you.
Purim. Thank you.
Rabbi, may I make 2 short comments? Or
Sure.
Sure, always.
Rabbi,
Yeah, what do you
Rabbi?
Rabbi, you began saying that Tanis Esther is really a victorious. During the shiur, I took out from my library the Shalach Kodesh Siddur, and I went through well, it's not kinos, the sliches to Tanis Esther, and you were 150% right.
Oh, thank you.
Every slicha has references to what happened. I was trying to find, maybe one of them does not have. They all had it. So first of all, thank you very much on that.
Thank you for the reinforcement, for the right. That's from the Shalom, you say.
Yeah, and then there is an opinion that Yafo was עיר שמוקפת חומה מימי יהושע בן נון, and today it's confusing because Yafo and Tel Aviv are one.
Right.
So what do you do?
That's a good question. Listen, also Yerushalayim itself is there's the old city, and then so there is a lot of controversy about how to define an Ir Mukefet Choma. But that's a topic in its own right, maybe for another time. But
Rabbi, Shalom Aleichem. How are you?
Yes.
How are you? You just mentioned briefly the concept of Hallel. I was just thinking as you were talking, according to the other Shita, that Kriyas Zu Hilula, in the case where we've pushed out or pushed forward the reading of the Megillah, maybe the 11th or 12th, whatever situation we discussed, would you say that is diametrically opposed to the concept of being Yotzei Hallel through the Kriyas Megillah, or that
that's an
Megillah,
interesting question. It's a great question. So the closest thing
I just would like to just follow up with that question one more time. Yeah. Just my second point to that question is, and if you feel that perhaps that it has to be Bo Bayom in order to be Yotzei Hallel through the Kriya of the Megillah, do you think, according to that Shita, if they read it early on the 11th, that they'd have to say Hallel on Purim? That's my follow-up question.
Right. So I think you could argue about these things. We don't have so much evidence one way or another. What we do have that's directly pertinent to what you're saying is the famous view of the Meiri. The Meiri says that if for any reason you don't have a Megillah, or you don't have somebody
access to Megillah,
that you actually would say Hallel on that.
Right.
So that doesn't necessarily mean, then some of the cases that you're asking where, maybe you have both in the end, you just have them on different days, that might be a different story. But, there's room for thinking about that only if you hold like the Meiri, which is that, there are two ways to understand, the Kriyasa Zuhi. That one is that, basically there's an obligation to say Hallel, and you fulfill that through the Megillah. And that's why the Meiri understood that if for some reason you're not saying the Megillah, then maybe you should say Hallel. And that opens the door to some of the scenarios that that you are raising as well, and they would be thought of in that way. Typically, people assume that, like the Rambam and most Rishonim don't understand, that line in the Gemara the same way that the Meiri does, and that what they understand is, that, Kriyas HaHallel, this is certainly how the Rav understood it, is that Kriyas HaHallel is like a different kind of, I'm sorry, Kriyas HaMegillah is a different kind of Hallel.
There's a kiyum of Hallel in the Megillah. There's a kiyum of Hallel
only
in the
through the Megillah,
Right.
because it's, it's not, like a Nes Meforsam.
Right.
And, it doesn't qualify, for the same reason that it's fulfilled through the Megillah, which itself doesn't have Shem Hashem, is,
Right.
V'natzelchu. It's all, in not only in the coincidences, but in the, it's a Nigeres and it's a Sefer, something I talked about, think about last year. So, it doesn't mean, you have an equal substitute, and therefore if you don't have the equal substitute, you'll say Hallel. It means that it's a different type of Hallel for a different type of celebration. And then under no conditions would you say
So I guess qualifying my question would you think the Miri would say that the one has to say Hallel?
Right, exactly. So I'm saying,
if I had
in light of the Meiri, your
Right.
questions become very relevant for sure.
Right. The other
And then
thing
I think
just
we
wanted,
you could wonder about it because, what are the parameters of it? But
right. The other thing I was
definitely-
just thinking was, as you discussed the difference of Tanis Esther versus all the other Tanesim, I mean, there is we know also there's a kiyum of at least the night of Purim, right? Of the Tanis in the Megillah itself. So you see that there's
so the transition, there's a lot of evidence. It's also right in the name of the Ryman, they say things that, like there's a discussion, about whether you can cut off the Tainus early if you said Kriyas Megillah early, or there's even a discussion whether there's a line in the Tashbitz, which I like to quote, where he says that even though, like this year is a great example of it, because you don't have Tainus Esther coming into Purim.
Right.
So he says, even if Purim is Chal on Motzoi Shabbos, and you don't have Tainus Esther in advance, you could still say Alanisim in Shmoneh Esrei. So the guy, what?
Oh, really?
So the guy who would have put out the thing, put out
Right.
footnotes on it, said, what do you mean? It's the opposite. If you are fasting, you might think that you shouldn't say Alanisim until you break your fast, but if you're not fasting, like why would you think that the absence of Tanis Esther would cause you to delay saying Alanisim till after Kriyas Megillah and not in the Shmoneh Esrei of Mar?
Right.
But the answer is the answer is that Tanis Esther is not something that is in conflict with Purim and Alanisim.
Right.
On the contrary, in some respects, it's the early celebration.
That's what you were talking before. That's what
exactly. So that's why that Tashbitz actually, instead of being a Pella, is actually a Raya. It's actually a very good, reflection of this idea. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Very good. Have a happy Purim, everybody.
Simchas Purim to you all, and we should have Soros Tovos.
Amen.
Purim.
Amen.